It's such a pleasure to be here back at Clifton talking again about love. I mean, one might ask, why again about love? And the reason is very simple. It's just such a hard topic to get right. I mean, is there anyone in the room? I mean, you know, please don't put up your hand. Anyone in the room who's happy about the state of their love life? Okay, all right, so I would say 85% are not, and thank you for coming. That's a great, and I think an optimistic number. Some of you are denying. We'll come back to you later, but look, it is. I speak to you as an expert on love, and my only criteria for my expertise is my phenomenal capacity for misery and mishap in this area. That really qualifies the expert in love as opposed to in other subjects. Proust once said that the best doctors are those who are very acquainted with illness. You should look out for a doctor who is often ill. And I think maybe the same thing applies to people who are giving you advice on love. Make sure that their love life is a mess, because from the wreckage, they have a chance of maybe pulling out something important. So, on that note, we love currently, the talk is billed as the sorrows of love. I think I must have been in a particularly bad mood when I suggested that topic. But we do love in history. We love a festival which features a lot of historians. And the way in which we love is so coloured by the era in which we live. There's a lovely quote from the 17th century French philosopher La Rochefoucauld. Some people would never have fallen in love if they hadn't heard there was such a thing. Very dark and cynical, but really what he's getting on about is that so many of our attitudes to love are socially governed and governed by the context in which we happen to be born and to operate. And very broadly, we are now currently living in the age of romanticism, which, I mean, don't hold me to this exactly, I'm wary of the historians in the room, but let's say that it's starting to show symptoms in the mid to late 18th century. By the early 19th century, we are firmly, across Western Europe, in the age of Romanticism. And Romanticism brings with it, it's first of all a movement in the arts and poetry, the visual arts, literature, but it also becomes a movement really of the heart. And all kinds of suggestions are made in the Romantic age for what love should look like. And it wasn't always the case, but lots of differences emerge. For a start, there's an enormous emphasis on finding one very special person called a soulmate. So you should find a soulmate. And the main trait of a soulmate is that you never argue about anything. You simply see eye to eye on everything. And most importantly, without speaking. You simply communicate wordlessly. So there's lots and lots of emphasis on the majesty of love being proved by wordless communication. The better suited you are, the fewer words you have to use in order to make your intentions known. Somebody else knows you already. It feels like a reconnection rather than a connection, because you are separated from birth. That old Greek idea is revived, and also this idea that it's going to last forever, that it isn't just a time-bound thing. That said, there's an enormous emphasis on an early death. So many of the great romantics die very, very early. So people get together, it looks absolutely swimming, things are going very well, particularly cough, and then tuberculosis, and within a few months, the whole show is over. But it would have been fabulous if only it had lasted. No one has a job. That's a very important thing, being a romantic. You're not really worrying about money. There's no mention of laundry, I think, in any great romantic text. So you're really focused on that one essential thing, which is to understand and be understood wordlessly by another. Sex develops a slightly new angle. Tragedy attends all infidelity. Suddenly, sex is seen as the bellwether of a good relationship, and therefore, if sex is happening outside the relationship, or if there's any kind of infidelity, this becomes a tragedy, and so it's elevated from a problem to a tragedy. And also, this notion that in order for, one of the great signs of love is that you may be suffering. It's kind of odd, because in a way, the romantics are putting an enormous emphasis on the nobility of love, but they're also emphasizing that to suffer in the name of love is quite key. So there's a lot of emphasis on yearning, of pining, on things not necessarily being right, and yet love being all the more intense for it. So a strange debt that love owes to grief and melancholy. what do these strange attitudes, romantic attitudes, lead to? Well, all kinds of real-world sorrows. For a start, an outbreak of sulking. What is sulking? Sulking is a very, I'm going in small, but it sheds light on something rather large. Sulking is a phenomenon that occurs when you feel that someone should understand you, without using words, but they haven't understood you, and therefore you will punish them for their stupidity and their cruelty by not speaking. So you will add to their suffering. So typical thing, a couple have an argument, and one person says to another, is anything wrong? And the other one goes, no, no. And says, please, something seems wrong. No, no, no. And you storm off, and this can last, a good sulk can last 24, 48 hours, and there's an absolute refusal to share with your lover what might be up, because that would be a violation of the romantic principle of love, which is a good lover knows you intuitively without using too many words. Also, belief in no secrets. So the idea is, if you have a pure heart, you will tell someone everything about yourself and your thoughts. And that's wonderful and beautiful in the early days of love. It gets a little trickier as time goes on. You spot a really charming person with the waiting team in a restaurant. You go, oh, they're cute. And the other one goes, oh, really? And suddenly, there's complexity in Eden. So we may start to doubt some of these romantic tenets. I'm definitely a skeptic. The other thing is a real hatred of criticism. We hear nowadays when couples break up, people will say things like, my partner just didn't accept me for who I really am. And everyone goes, oh, of course, what an awful person. Because surely a sign of love is to accept someone in their entirety. If we pause and think about this is really a stunning demand that we should be trying to make of someone. They should accept us in our entirety. None of us should accept ourselves in our entirety, let alone extend that privilege to somebody else. So I tend to look back to an ancient Greek view which sees love as a process of education. The Greeks thought that education is something that lovers can do in the privileged sanctum of a relationship. They can use the confidence and the security that a relationship brings to educate one another to become their better selves. And this is not something that's a given, and it's something that requires work, which again is a very strange word to use whenever the word romanticism is used, the idea of work. It would all sound very odd. If you said to your beloved, look, I've been to a lecture by this guy, he's sort of saying that I can actually criticize you for certain things. He's given me license, he's referenced Plato, and on this basis, I would like to tell you that you chew loudly, your snoring is a little bit off, and sometimes, you sound a little fake and sentimental in conversation. This is not necessarily right, but under the aegis of a more traditional Greek view of love, that could be very much what we want. So the idea of love as a process of education. One of the things that in the post-romantic age we've learned a lot about is psychotherapy. And I speak to you as a trained psychotherapist. I practice psychotherapy. It's a new, late-in-life move that I've made. And one of the first things, the sort of basic tenet of psychotherapy, it's so basic, but it's also maddening. So let's look at it in the face. The maddening tenet is that who you are now owes an awful lot to your childhood, which is the most depressing idea. You may be 40, 50, 60, some of you in the 90s, and still to be brought back to those formative 0 to 10, it's deeply depressing. How can this possibly be true? And so many people are apt to deny it, as we are with many unpleasant things. But I want to argue that the way in which we are encoded in early childhood really is momentous and worth paying attention to. It's rather like the inculcation of language. Between the age of 0 and 5, all of us, simply by virtue of hanging around other people, will acquire an enormously complex grammatical vocabulary comprising tens of thousands of declensions, verb endings, tenses, etc. And all of this goes on without anyone paying any attention. We're doing handstands in the garden, painting buttercups in the kitchen, and we are acquiring an entire language, which once we've got it, so we acquire it without noticing it's happening, and then once we've got it, it's enormously hard to shift. To speak to anyone who's trying to learn Korean in middle-aged or Finnish or whatever, it will take you hours and hours to reprogram your linguistic capacities. I want to say that something similar is going on in the emotional realm, that here too we are picking up, as it were, an emotional grammar, with all kinds of declensions and meanings. And they're around things like, what is my worth? What is a man? What is a woman? What happens when you trust someone? What happens when you make an error? Who gets forgiven? How much tolerance is there? Etc., etc. And childhood, without us knowing it, provides answers. And some of those answers are very sane and very good, and many, unfortunately, are really quite wonky. And we spend the rest of our lives walking into situations with expectations formed that absolutely don't match the reality in front of us. And this leads us to an awful lot of problems. If you look at most of the crazy things that people do in adulthood, people are, think of your craziest friends and what they're up to at the moment. This one drinks too much. That one can never open up in a relationship. That one doesn't stop making silly jokes, etc., etc. We've all got our list of sort of slightly eccentric and self-defeating things that people are doing in adult life. One way to look at this, one way to interpret this, is to think, well, what's going on here, essentially, is that someone is continuing to do in the adult world what they used to do as a child in ways that were, at that time, extremely helpful and helped them to get through their childhood. Most of the maladaptations of adulthood are really extremely skilled and clever techniques for adapting to difficult circumstances in your family of origin. So take somebody, for example, who you meet them in adult life, you're trying to have a relationship with them, and you realize that they don't have any feelings. They're not there really emotionally. And this is terribly maddening, and you might go to therapy, and you might end up divorced, etc., etc. You think, well, what's going on? Well, that's likely to be a hangover of somebody who grew up in an environment where, for all sorts of reasons, maybe there was an alcoholic parent, a suicidal parent, a violent parent, it was incredibly clever and hugely useful to disassociate from present circumstances, to cut yourself off from what you were feeling, not to feel the feelings that were in fact reverberating through you. That was a strategy of genius. The problem is, if you continue that into adulthood, you will end up with great problems. And this is what tends to keep happening to people, and it can explain an awful lot. So next time you've got, if you're working through problems with your partner, or indeed yourself, ask yourself, that thing I keep doing that seems to make absolutely no sense now, might it once have made sense? And really it's the idea of unspooling a logic that once held firm and convincing yourself that it no longer does apply, even though it seems intuitively that it should apply. There are people, for example, who can never be serious. I was working with somebody who just made jokes all the time, very funny, but there was no way of getting through to anything serious, and there was an awful lot that was serious in this person's life, but they couldn't ever get anywhere close to it. Later emerged that this person was the heir to a childhood in which their mother was extremely fragile, would keep saying things like, "You'll be the end of me. One more problem and you'll be the end of me." So what do you become as a child? Well, first of all, you become an adult very quickly. By the way, any of you in the room who were told and praised very early on for being old for your years? Anyone here was old for their years? Yeah, come and see me afterwards, because that's a very telling one. No one should be old for their years. We should all have the privilege of being able to develop at exactly, roughly, the biological age that we're at. And very often, we're having to be adults because people in the room are children who shouldn't be. And so, when adults are children, children need to become adults. So there's a terrible, and this is another thing, another very great complexity of psychological life, which is we have these demands, these stages that we need to go through. The stage of being able to feel irresponsible, the stage of being able to explore our sexuality, the stage of being able to cause a fuss, etc. Many of us are not allowed, at the time when we might have explored these stages, to properly go into them. But the body and the mind has a stubborn desire to go back and re-thread through stages that were missed. And so you get the very tragic spectacle of people in their 40s and 50s who suddenly need to go back, and everyone's going, they're like a teenager. And everyone goes, oh, well, how silly. Well, that's precisely what they may be doing, because there's a kind of necessity to repeat and rehearse lessons that were skipped. So one way to think about our journey through adult life is that there is an emotional curriculum, not as well known as other kinds of curriculum, but there is an emotional curriculum, and if we skip bits of it, we're liable to have to go back and pick up things that we left off. All of this leads us to an awful lot of distortions when it comes to picking a partner. See, in the old world of love, picking a partner was done by your community, and it was done on practical terms. They've got a plough, you've got an ox, fantastic, you'll get together. And that's how it was done. And Romanticism removed that practical material necessity and put forward a much more compelling, really beautiful answer, which is you should get together with people with whom you'll be happy. Oh, wonderful, that's such common sense. Except, of course, our approach to love is infinitely complicated in this arena, because really what we're wired to do, it turns out, is not to seek happiness but familiarity. And for many of us, what is familiar is not to be happy. It is, in fact, to suffer, to long, to yearn, to feel the need to prove oneself, to abase oneself before someone who feels wiser than us but also undeserving, etc., etc. And this explains all the people that I'm sure, the good ones among us set up on dates. You know, that sort of phenomenon. You get a friend and you think, oh, I know exactly who would suit you. And you set them up, and then you call them up, and you go, how did the date go? And they go, yeah, they're really nice, really nice. And you go, nice, well, you know something's up. And they go, yeah, just somehow something not, and then people go, chemistry, etc. But really, if your friend were able to be fully honest about what was going on, probably what's going on there is, if they could express what they feel is, I'm sensing that the person is probably a little bit too healthy to enforce on me a level of suffering that I associate with being loved. And so therefore I'm in danger of being unfulfilled because I'm going to be fulfilled, and that's not allowed under the script that I'm carrying unconsciously within me. Very complicated. No wonder we're all a bit unhappy in love. It's very, very complicated. By the way, most of the madness of the world does, in one way or another, come from a deficit of love. I mean, if you spend time in psychiatric wards, as I've done, no one ends up in a psychiatric ward who's been properly loved in childhood. I mean, maybe one or two, but really not very many. Almost all disturbances are disturbances of failures of love. And what do we mean by love? It's really the capacity of an adult to enter into a young child's experience and for a time to give that child a sense that they are the center of the universe, that their concerns are taken seriously, that their pain is being listened to. And even though many parents are so well-meaning, very many parents, nevertheless, some parents are not well-meaning at all, but even the well-meaning ones sometimes get it wrong. I was in a hotel in Greece in the summer, and I remember there was a little girl bawling her eyes out, screaming about something. And then the mother went up to her, and she said, what's wrong? And she said, and the girl said, I want to go home. And the mother said, don't be so silly. It's a beautiful hotel, and it costs us a lot of money. You can see where they're coming from, but it's not necessarily the best possible answer. Also hear people say, child's crying on its birthday. Why are you crying? It's my birthday. You can't be crying. Your granny's come to visit you. Well, as a child, you may not be interested in granny. There are lots of realities of child experience which many parents don't have room for. And it's tremendously important for a parent, for a time, to give a child a sense of what the great English psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called a true self. He divided a person into a true self and a false self. A true self is the seat of your authentic being, who you really want to be, what you're actually feeling, what you actually want, yearn for, protest against, etc. And Winnicott argued that for healthy development, we have to go through a period where that true self is acknowledged. And then, of course, as we enter school and develop, we need to develop what he called a false self. A false self, how was your weekend? Fantastic. Clifton, great, etc. You can lie a little bit. No, not you would lie about this, but you can lie in order to maintain other proprieties. But in order for life to feel tolerable and creative and real, there has to have been that experience of the true self. And many people pitch up in adult relationships, and if it doesn't sound strange, they don't know how to be authentic in the relationship. They would like to be. They would like to connect with another person, but because no one connected with them as a child, they can't connect with another as an adult. And they may not even be able to express what's going on. They just feel slightly removed and not quite present. And it's extremely poignant because they're obviously not doing it on purpose. They just don't know how to put their true self across because it was never wanted. Part of the difficulty is that our minds are extremely reluctant to tell us any of this stuff directly. I mean, it's all very, very indirect. Our minds have obviously evolved for practical action, forward behavior, fending off dangers, etc., and we were dead by 30. Now we have long lives, and we're trying to be happy in a way we never were before. And this sets up enormous conundrums. Sometimes people say, I was sitting next to a very nice chap yesterday, and he said, why don't you just talk to your friends? Who needs therapy? Who needs to spend all that time reading? I so sympathize with him. It's so boring. I mean, and it would be so nice if your friends knew it, but it's rather like saying, look, why do you need a pilot? I mean, just, you land the plane. And I'm sure there are some amateur pilots who would do a fairly good job, and that's absolutely fine. But on the whole, unfortunately, we have no option but to drill into some of the complexities. it's, as I say, it's so boring. But it's rather like the phenomenon of microbiology. You know, in the late 19th century, microbiologists started telling us that in an average glass of water, there could be enough microbiotic life to poison an entire city, that there could be creatures living at a visual level that could do serious damage. And people thought, oh, that's crazy, it looks like a clear glass of water. Well, it could destroy a whole city's water supply, despite looking clear. Something like this is a good analogy for psychological life, where again, things may look clear, but they're liable to be extremely complex. And so a lot of the time, you know, we don't acknowledge what's happening in our minds until and unless our bodies become the early warning signals of something that's very badly wrong. An idea that you haven't found time to express, or the capacity to express verbally, has a horrible habit of showing up in your lower back, in your shoulders, in your kidneys, etc. There is a way in which unexpressed thoughts become bodily symptoms. They also become insomnia. One way to look at insomnia is that it's a kind of revenge for all the thoughts that you manage not to have in the middle of the day, coming back at you at 3 a.m. So if you want to sleep more, one of the things to do is to try and open up those channels of communication, which otherwise can only happen in the middle of the night. Something that's really important to understand about love is that, you know, we think we want love. We think that love is the thing that we need and want. But it's really important to stress that we are as terrified of love as we are excited by it. And for all the talk of yearning and wanting partners, etc., you know, you always meet people who say things like, I've been looking for a partner, and, you know, I really want to get together with someone, and everybody's feeling very charitable and sorry for them, they haven't met someone. But, you know, I think we also have to acknowledge there is an enormous terror of love, because love asks something enormous of us, which is to lower the drawbridge and become vulnerable in the face of another person. And especially if this journey hasn't gone particularly right in childhood, we are liable to be extremely scared. One analogy is to think of somebody who's been living in a prison camp, and has had to get used to a calorie-controlled diet over many years. And then suddenly one day, the prison camp is released, and they're able to leave and enter a very well-fed room stocked with loads and loads of food, a luxurious buffet. That person may not be able to metabolize and digest the goodness on offer. They may even die from an excess of the thing that, in theory, they need and would have wanted. But it's just that their stomach has so shrunk over many years that they're unable to make use of something that's otherwise very good. And it's on that basis that we sometimes see people who seem to sabotage love, to destroy love, precisely because it's so threatening to an economy that they have painfully had to build up. One way to, you know, think about what might happen after romantic love historically. You know, if we think of those ages that we've gone through, the age of material love or dynastic love, where essentially people would get together for dynastic material reasons, ox, plough, etc. Then came romantic love, where people are driven together by feeling, a kind of unexamined feeling. So that if you say to someone, you know, I've met someone after 2 weeks, we're getting married in Vegas, people go, oh, that's so romantic. Oh, that's so, you've known each other for 2 weeks and you're getting married in Vegas. So romantic. Anytime anyone uses that word romantic, ring a bell and call the police, because it's on the whole a sign of very serious trouble. It's a sign, it's almost always a sign of something that's being misunderstood. It's not a good idea at all I know we've got Jane Austen being talked about, I think soon. One of the great things about Jane Austen is she was one of the last writers to think about money in the context of love. She's got really fascinating things to offer us. Nowadays, if you're a good lover, you absolutely don't think about money. I mean, it really doesn't matter. Someone has sleeps on a park bench. How marvelous, absolutely great, fantastic. It really doesn't matter at all because they're so nice. Their heart is big. Jane Austen lists the income of every single one of her characters. And why does she do this? Because she's got a very nuanced view of the role of money in a good life. And she thinks that it is important that there is some money. And like a good Christian, she thinks it's not so much the sum of money that counts as the attitude towards it. So if you have a good attitude to money, you know that money isn't everything, but you also respect what it can do for you. And a good domestic life is built on a certain level of income so that people are not driven half crazy by the need to accumulate and not made to have shortcuts, etc. So a very wise view. So that, that was the... Jane Austen sits on that borderline between a pre-romantic age and romanticism itself. So what might we look forward to? What might happen after romanticism? And I think one of the things that we might be thinking about is what you might call a therapeutic relationship. Because really what's happened is, over the long 20th century, psychotherapy and psychoanalysis is the dominant discipline which has looked at relationships. And though it's very annoying, and we like Freud to have been totally wrong, sadly he wasn't in all sorts of ways. I'll come on to that in a minute. But really, I think one of the best things we can do is approach one another with some of the attitudes with which anyone who's been in psychotherapy will be quite familiar, which is a basic sense that we are all crazy. Who here is crazy? Fantastic. All right, everyone who didn't put up their hands, you're the crazy ones. I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, but I know you were shy, and if we redid the experiment, you put it up now. But what I mean by crazy is that to be aware of the ways in which we are distorted, which we are carrying things, normally from childhood, which make us, at points, quite difficult to live with. Who thinks they're difficult to live with? You're not difficult to live with. It's the other ones who are difficult to live with. You get the point, right? Next time you'll be getting it, right? So it's really the idea that a certain degree of self-awareness around problems is a really good indicator of being a good match. At this organization called the School of Life that I run, we always say that people going on a first date should ask one another, and how are you mad? And if your partner, when you say, how are you mad, says, how do you mean? I'm not mad at all. Well, that's such an odd question. Again, run, just pay the bill and just take your leave. Then this is not a person. If someone goes, yeah, I'm a little eccentric, well, fantastic. They are having a good relationship to their difficult sides, which means they're going to be easy. So that's, by the way, when people say they want someone with a good sense of humor, that's really what they mean. Someone who is not going to grandstand around their difficulty. The number one sorrow of love is defensiveness, the inability to accept one's fragilities and one's wrongness in the eyes of another because one thinks one's going to be so attacked. And it's absolutely delicious. I mean, one of the most romantic things that you can ever say is, I think I've been a bit of an idiot. Let me think about that. Let me go away and think about that. I think you may have a point. I'm going to think about that. That's sexy, by the way. That's really great. Actually, I've got another line to try on you. I was writing about this the other day. So, competition for the most romantic statement, I mean truly romantic statement, you could tell somebody, is, well, you could say all sorts of things, you're lovely, but, by romantic I mean able to assist one in creating a good relationship. And it's this. It's something like this. If you don't treat me well, I'll be off. Cassandra, if you don't treat me well, I'm going to be off. Why on earth would that qualify as a romantic, as a good statement? Tell you why. Because one of the things that goes very, very wrong in relationships is people walk into relationships having had experience, normally in childhood, of being royally walked upon by absolutely everybody. I mean, everyone in families knows that there is the proverbial doormat. And the doormat is because the parents are having dramas, maybe there's a sibling who's having a drama, etc., and somebody is the good child. And beware of the good child. There are lots of problems with the good child. So the good child grows up, and they've been so meek, and they don't give anyone any problems, etc., etc., and then they get in a relationship, and they notice that they've lost themselves in the relationship. They notice after 20 years, by which time it's too late. So Instagram is big on this, but bless Instagram, it's got some good ideas. Boundaries. Americans are big on this. You need a few boundaries. I'm not going to put up with this thing. Please, can you be kind? I need you to be good to me. These sound like very perplexing demands to make of a lover. They're absolutely not. And the other thing that's very strange is that people will generally treat us as we expect to be treated. So if we walk into a relationship expecting to be beaten up, well, we may be beaten up quite quickly. I mean, literally, tragically. Whereas if we emit an atmosphere that this is absolutely not what's going to happen, well, it stands a much, much smaller chance of actually happening. So our expectations start to determine our realities in relationships. But again, we won't be able to set those expectations right unless we've done a bit of psychotherapy, or at least thought about it a bit. Let's talk about sex. We've got some time to talk about sex. So sex is an interesting one. What on earth, what is it? What's going on? So here's a theory about what's kinky. It sounds very odd. Forgive me, and hopefully no children in the audience. But let me tell you a little bit about my theory, or a theory of kinks. One view is that we find exciting in adult life, sexually, things that sit upon areas of difficulty and trauma from childhood. And if you want to try and find what someone will find particularly erotic, one question to ask yourself and ask them is, what was difficult for them when they were growing up? We could say, this is a very strange question, growing up, adult life, very weird, etc. Well, the two are intimately related. And one of the things that we find is that behind many sources of excitement, there is something that was once difficult. Let me give you an example. I'd been researching this area. One person I came across was someone who said that in her childhood, she had extremely intrusive, bossy, dominating parents, never knocked at the door, always stormed in, wanted to know all her business, etc. No privacy, absolutely no privacy, constant invasion of space. What might this person's sexual kink be? Well, I'm not going to throw it yet open to the floor, but let me tell you, this woman was extremely aroused by control, by the ability to say to a partner, you will sit in this chair and you will not move, and I will tell you exactly what to do, and you will not stir until I give you permission and orders, etc. This was bliss. This was heaven on earth for her, because precisely she had had such an experience of something opposed. And so often we think of sexual excitement as really strange, outside the remit of logical understanding. It is very solidly within the remit of logical understanding. We simply have to follow the trail of details. There was one person that I met who was very unsure of her father's affection. And when she was 15, she got into trouble off the coast of Spain. And the father dived in and risked his life in order to save her. And in the process, almost drowned himself. But he was able to save her. And she knew then that her father absolutely loved him. And 15 years of doubt about someone's emotional capacities and dedication were answered in that moment. What was her kink? What is her kink? She was able to tell a research team that for her, orgasm was impossible without imagining a situation of grave danger where someone rescued her. A fireman, a war journalist, someone is able to rescue her from a very dangerous situation, and that produces the necessary release and excitement. So don't think of excitement as something cut off from our psychology. This is the achievement of 20th century psychoanalysis to thread back sexual excitement to many of the large themes of psychology and many of the very serious themes of psychology. Let me talk to you about the Oedipus complex, which is a very weird idea that you find in Freud. And it's really the idea that little boys are in love with their mothers and little girls are in love with their fathers. And it sounds so weird. You think, what, little girl wants to have sex with daddy? It just sounds so odd. But let's just look calmly at the whole situation. Freud observed, and lots of research has shown, that in order for proper adult development to occur, there has to be a rather peculiar process whereby a child becomes aware of their sexual potency and power by the parent in childhood acknowledging in a very gentle, very hands-off, very distant way, their potency and desirability. The message essentially is, if I wasn't married to your mother, father, you'd be a lovely person to be with. It's a kind of as-if situation. It's a very subtle suggestion. And of course, there are children who fall on either side, they become the victims of their parents' own unresolved feelings on this. So there'll be the seductive parent who, again, without necessarily anything physical taking place, will somehow say things like, oh, well, why don't you call me at this time when your mother's going to be out? Because we'll have a livelier chat. And sort of like trying to take the child into a sort of private realm. Or as a parent who just blocks off the child completely, refuses to acknowledge their growing strength, potency, attractiveness, etc. That can lead to a huge set of problems as well. So we're starting to get a sense, and this is really a very painful insight of psychotherapy, not very much has to go wrong for very big things to go wrong. In other words, it has a tragic structure in the way that it was the genius of the Greek tragedians to observe that very small slips would have very big impacts on lives. And exactly the same is true in psychological life. Someone doesn't have to set out to be evil for extremely difficult things to be unleashed. Let's talk a little bit more about sexual perversion, because that's another thing that comes up a lot, because it helps us to understand what sex is. Think of the voyeur, someone who can only have sex when they're looking at a telescope of somebody very far away. Think of the flasher, who can only get sexual excitement by opening their raincoat at somebody. And if you wanted to frighten the flasher, you'd go up to them and go, "Ooh, lovely, let's go to Clifton together, it'd be a lovely time." They would run for the hills, they're absolutely terrified. What's that telling us? It tells us that intimacy is extremely difficult, and the more perturbed the childhood, the more perturbing intimacy will be. And that's what is really cropping up in so-called sexual. Every sexual perversion is really a perversion around intimacy. And it gets more and more extreme. The sex murderer. What is this thing called sex murder, where people have sex with someone and then kill them? It makes no logical sense. Great logic. This is a thesis that the NHS Portman Clinic uses always. The moment that a victim of a sex attack tends to get killed is when their eyes meet the eyes of their attacker. And it's being seen and recognized as a full human being that is so awful that the person needs to be killed for what they have witnessed, which is the reality of another person, the true self of another person. And that's what's intolerable to the very damaged and perturbed a person who's doing it. This is incidentally the origins of paedophilia and zoophilia as well. The animal doesn't know what's going on. The child doesn't know what's going on, and that's precisely what the paedophile, zoophile is excited by. The fact the unconsciousness of the child or the animal is what they're after. There's no danger of reciprocity. What does this tell us? This tells us how difficult reciprocal relationships really are. And that the proverbial person who, after sex, says, oh, I think I just need to go in the other room for a little bit. I'm just going to scroll on Instagram for a couple of hours just to calm down. What they're really doing is saying, essentially, this was a little too close and I need some distance. And the more closeness has been difficult in childhood, the more that closeness, when we re-meet it in adulthood, is likely to have repercussions. This is, of course, the territory of attachment theory, which is the great British development that took place in the 1950s, early 1960s, partly as a result of studies of orphans and displaced children in the war, in the Second World War, and the recognition that a child who is separated from their parents is liable to suffer a really, until then, unknown degree of suffering and psychological after effects on the basis that they've been separated from their parents at an early age. And attachment theory tells us many things, but one of the things it tells us very broadly is that there are really two fears in love. One is the fear of being engulfed by another person, being swallowed up by them, by one's boundaries are giving way under the sort of subsuming nature of another person. And then the other problem is the problem of loneliness. So somehow all love affairs have to sail between the Scylla and Charybdis of a fear of engulfment and a fear of loneliness. And everyone's coming to a relationship with a different level of fear of engulfment, fear of loneliness. And attachment theory gives names to these people. So we've got, on the one hand, the securely attached, who are people who essentially trust that an attachment, a close attachment to another person, is going to go well. And this is apparently about 50% of the population. None of them are here. They went to the other talk because they thought, sorrows of love, yeah, I'm fine. So we're all here. And we're divided between the other two categories that attachment theory likes to talk about. On the one hand, the avoidantly attached. And the avoidantly attached are essentially people who find closeness so difficult they have no option psychologically other than, when things get close, to withdraw, sometimes very suddenly, sometimes almost without explanation. They run out of relationships, or day to day within a relationship, they find they constantly are doing what one psychologist called distance management. They're constantly monitoring the distance between themselves and their partner and introducing something that will introduce more distance. Maybe they've got to go away on business for work. Maybe it's their granny's birthday, so they've got to leave. Maybe they're going to have an argument with you about nothing in particular. Don't know why we got into that argument, but the great thing about an argument is that we've moved from closeness to now no one's talking, we're at the opposite ends of the room, no danger of closeness, so distance has again been stretched and recovered. So that's the avoidant person, constantly seeking to stretch the distance. And then there's the anxious person, the anxiously attached person, who's normally someone who did experience close love in childhood, but it was interrupted. So they've had an experience of close love, but they also know how at risk it is of disappearing. And that's why they cling very tightly. And it's called anxious attachment, but really, that's too polite. Really, its most observable form, and what it should be renamed, is angry attachment. Because the anxiously attached person essentially always thinks that the other person doesn't love them enough. On their gravestone, it could say, "No one loved me enough." Anyone in the room feel that no one loves them enough? No one loves them enough. Yeah, a few, we're soulmates. A few others, you're a bit shy. But anyway, yes, so that constant feeling, I'm underloved. And then an angry response. You're 5 minutes late. Why didn't you put out the bins? Most struggles of this sort between couples, we're terribly bad at properly translating our feelings into something that's communicable to another person. So a typical anxious attachment squabble with maybe an avoidantly attached person will be to say, you're 2.5 minutes late. I was expecting you earlier. Why the hell didn't you come back for dinner? And where's the message? To which the other one goes, you're so clinging. My God, I've got no space in this relationship. And then boom, explosion. I mean, anxious avoidant couplings are the most ferocious. Couples therapists are always dealing with anxious avoidant couplings. What the anxious person really wants to say is, I really, really miss you and love you and need you. And I'm raw like a child. And all I want to do is have a hug. But they can't bear to say that because admitting need was experienced as so intolerable in childhood. And so what they need to do is to just be angry and proud and strong. It's always really useful. If you tell people, if you couldn't make this complaint, they're rude, they didn't change the bins, etc. If you had to name that wish in another way, maybe you even put it in the words of a child, what might you want to say to your partner? And very poignantly, often the thing is, I need you, I'm lonely, I'm sad, give me a hug. These are the things that underlie some of our fiercest, most sort of administrative complaints against other people. And of course, it's so unhelpful. What do we do about all of this? I think one of the things we learn is that love is essentially a skill and not an instinct. I mean, we're sold by the romantic worldview that love is something that's going to just happen spontaneously. It really won't. We need to educate ourselves. We need to be able to go back to schools of love and take modules in this and accept that we're not very good at it. It's a tremendously generous sentiment to give to your partner, to say, I went to a talk and this guy was kind of encouraging me to admit that I may be a pretty bad lover. We might go, oh, I'm not a bad lover. I mean, maybe in all senses. What a wonderful starting point to think, maybe I don't really know how to do this very well. This is an incredibly generous starting point and the birth of so much closeness, because closeness ultimately is built out of vulnerability, and vulnerability is built out of an admission of fragility. Things that in the outside world we're not rewarded for. And this is what makes love so difficult, that the outside world rewards us for precisely the skills that, if we showed them in love, are a disaster, and vice versa. So we really, this is the problem of a modern age where we say, we want work-life balance, etc. If we really want a flourishing relationship, we're going to have to get a lot more intelligent about what relationships are. We do live an awfully long time. The quality of your relationship determines up to 80% of the quality of your life. If we really engineered educational curricula based on that statistic, we'd be studying such different things. We really would be putting people to work on how to identify a partner, how to have conversations with a partner, etc., etc. People who are dating, they often say things like, oh, I've been on these dating apps, they're useless, and you can't meet anyone, etc., etc. And really what they're complaining about is something that we don't know what to say about, which is there's not a good supply of lovers. And the reason is that no one thinks of educating lovers. We know that if there's a shortage of engineers, what do? We found engineering schools. We put people through a 5, maybe even 10-year program of very rigorous education. So we will get the brain surgeons, the pilots, the engineers that we need. When it comes to love, we think, I'm not meeting anyone on these apps. Rather than thinking, the reason you're not meeting anyone is because there isn't anyone, and the reason there isn't anyone is because there aren't any schools for love. And so no one's coming through the pipeline because no one's bothering to do the training that would be required in order to do this. We invented agriculture because we were fed up of looking on the underside of bushes and hoping that something, a strawberry would have grown in the wild. That's why we invented agriculture. And so we need to have a similar approach, I think, to in the realm of relationships. Why do we even want love? Partly I think it's because if you spent a bit too long on your own, one of the things you'll notice is you're going a bit mad. You know what I mean? When you've spent a weekend, you start off, on a Friday night on your own, you haven't made any plans, and by the time it's Sunday morning, you're getting a little bit peculiar. You're just, certain things are kind of slipping, etc. And by Sunday afternoon, you're calling up, just anyone, because it doesn't really matter who they are. You just need another person. What's that person doing? They're recalibrating your sense of perspective, your sense of self, etc. There can be something immensely salutary about a superficial conversation which just reminds you of where you end and reality begins. And to be too long inside our own minds is very, very difficult. And one of the ways of interpreting what a partner does for us is to regulate us. They constantly are noticing things about us and trying to bring us back towards something that might seem a little bit like sanity. They're trying to bring us back to a midpoint where we're better able to see things with wisdom and sanity. And so that's something that we're going to need to learn. My hope, just finishing up now, my hope for the future is that we will enter a properly therapeutic age where it will be normal practice for lovers to spend quite a lot of time understanding their past, quite a lot of time understanding the distortions with which they are entering relationships. There's a very useful term in psychotherapy called projection. The idea of projection is that you have expectations that are formed in the family of your birth around what a man is, what a woman is, what happens when someone gets angry, what happens when someone is sad, what you should do in a crisis, etc. And that these will lead you to expectations which will form the basis of your projections that you then bring into adult life. And the problem is that some of our projections are absolutely fine. They're not problematic at all. But there is the problematic projection, which is somebody raises their voice and you think it's a catastrophe. Well, no, it's not. Maybe it's just somebody raising their voice, which is actually fine. In your childhood, it might have been the harbinger of absolute disaster, but you're not 5 anymore. And very often there's a part of us that simply cannot acknowledge that time has moved on. We've moved out of the crucible in which we learn to lesson. We're now in a different world. And a lot of what, acceding to proper adulthood is about is reminding the younger part of us, which is operating in us. I mean, there's a 5-year-old, there's a 6-year-old. No part of us that we ever were is ever totally disappears. They are simply subsumed and they operate like a system of Russian dolls within us. And to be able to say to the younger self, thank you so much for that response that was shaped in childhood. We don't need it anymore. If you're going to keep responding like this, you will make a mess of relationships, work things, you will sabotage your best chances, etc. So to be able to enter relationships with a therapeutic awareness, and also, very importantly, a therapeutic attitude of forgiveness, that when you see your partner acting in ways that are counterproductive, rather than thinking, as it's so tempting to do, they're trying to ruin my life, and it really does feel that way, to imagine that other than that goal to completely destroy you, they are also simply acting out things that they are not fully in command of. And if we can extend them some forgiveness, they may be able to extend us some forgiveness, and it may be the beginning of something. On that note, I'm going to end it, but we do have a chance, 15 minutes, for some live therapy. So if some of you have got dilemmas of love, I'd be really happy to try and answer them. But thank you so much for listening to this bit. And do put up your hands, we've got some mics, and then we can take some questions. And as I say, be as personal as you feel comfortable being. Thank you. You had a question?
The subconscious mind, does that come into your...
Does it come to the subconscious mind? Absolutely, it's everywhere. I call it the unconscious mind. But absolutely, look, it's something that we accept very readily when it comes to most aspects of our functioning. We accept that when we have lunch, most of what happens once we swallow is going to go on unconsciously. We will not be aware of what our liver is doing, what our stomach is doing. We know that when we walk across the courtyard, we don't know consciously what we're doing, but our legs are moving very agilely across the gravel. So most of the things that we do are not conscious. That applies to emotional life as well. And that's slightly tricky. So we accept something that we accept at a physical level. You're not conscious of how you walk, you're not conscious of how you digest, you're not conscious of how you fall asleep, is also apparent in psychological life. And Freud famously said that the purpose of psychoanalysis was to make as much of the unconscious conscious as possible. We'll never fully get there. Most of us will go to our deaths not quite knowing who we are. On most of our gravestones, it should say, here lies Jim Smith, who didn't quite know who Jim Smith was, but they were giving it a shot. And that's the weird thing about interpersonal life, that you look at somebody and you think, well, that person's got eyes and a mouth, and so they must know who they are. I'm a bit at sea, but that person, they look like they're a person. And of course, that's one of the great deceptions of interpersonal life. All of us are incredibly confused about who we are. And people say, how are you? How was your weekend? And we give these pat answers. But if you really put a microphone inside most of our minds, we're at sea. We're properly at sea. We're mostly made of water. And most of our mental life is as complex as an ocean. And so we need to be ready for that and acknowledge that in ourselves and in others and give room for that and be generous on that basis. Thank you. Yeah.
How good are we, through therapy or other means, of actually acting on it
right.
and rewinding
how good are we at unwinding? How good are we at learning Korean? how good are we at learning Korean, middle-aged? So you're 45, you go to a Korean lesson, how's it going after a year? Progress will be halting. Depends how often you do it, depends how much work you put into it. But to think that it's going to take any less effort than learning a new language, absolutely not. I mean, people say things like, I went to therapy, I went once a month for a couple of months, and it's useless. I'm no different. And you think, well, I mean, that's as useless. How good are you at tennis after? This is very challenging. You really need to work at it. And you not only need to work at it alone, you need to have a group of people around you who are engaged in it. It's incredibly difficult stuff. But isn't it exciting as well? Shouldn't it be glamorized? We glamorize throwing javelins across bits of grass, and we give people medals for that. It's not very easy to throw a javelin either, but we've got processes in place, and we really glamorize it, and we think it's wonderful. Well, in my ideal world, we should be glamorizing getting over a pattern of anger, or getting over a pattern of anxious attachment, or learning to forgive. There should be shows on television, Olympiads, where we pin medals to people who've most been able to reduce the impact of awful arguments on the weekend with their partner. That person should be knighted. So lots to be done in that area.
Alan, you said that we need to be educated in love. Which authors do you think speak the best about love?
Which authors speak the best about love, other than me? Because, okay. So, look, it's a good question. It really is a good question. I wish I could point you to one Bible. I've spent my life reading authors and being a bit of a magpie and dipping in here, dipping in there. I'm very keen on the English psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. Does he give you totally the right answer? I mean, it's the boring thing about books that we want an text, a Bible that's got it all. And the truth is we probably have to read an awful lot of things, and that's why I do believe in only partly reading books and skimming books, because many books are not totally for us. And there may be only 4 lines, very important 4 lines in a book for us, but we might need to travel very far through many libraries. So I wish I could point you to one definitive text other than mine on love, but I can't yet. But do come to the bookshop later. Yeah. Yes. Someone.
Are you married?
Am I married? Such a good question.
And the second question, where does MDMA come into your therapy, if it does at all?
Okay. Am I married? MDMA therapy. I was married. I did write a little essay called "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person." That was a couple of years before the marriage ended. So as for MDMA therapy, look, Freud speculated in one of his very last letters to a fellow doctor. He said, wouldn't it be amazing if there was a substance that you could take that would more easily open the doors of the unconscious and allow people access to thoughts that they're very scared of? Ultimately, what makes thinking so hard is it's so frightening. Why do people find it so hard to think? It's because once you start thinking, why is it intolerable to be on an aeroplane with nothing to do other than to stare outside the window? Because you may be confronted by bits of yourself. And one of the tragedies of the modern world is opportunities to be forced to be alone are ever smaller. And it's very, very sad because our phones, these tools of communication, are really enemies of communication with ourselves. Why do we need to communicate with ourselves? Because it's not automatic. What we think is something we've got to go and find. And you have to do some very odd exercises. There's some wonderful exercises, like lying in bed in the darkness and saying to yourself, what do I feel? You might think, well, don't you know what you feel? No, you don't know what you feel. You may need to lie in the darkness and literally say, what's been going on for me, really? I know what's been going on the surface, but what am I really feeling? I mean, we can all do this exercise, right? Right now, we think, okay, we know what we're doing minute by minute, where we'll be, 20 minutes, but what are we actually feeling? It's happening in a different register. And so often, modern life, or life generally, pulls us away out of that connection with that deeper self, where many of the most important feelings of rage, feelings of disappointment, feelings of hope, feelings of longing, plans to change our lives, plans to tell people things they really need to hear, etc. All of these thoughts are often associated with difficulty if we put them into practice. So they're difficult, but necessary. So what do? Shove them back in the cupboard and suffer from them and twitch. A symptom, this is a Freudian idea, a symptom is always the result of a thought that has not been had, of a feeling that has not been felt. And so the goal of the therapeutic enterprise is to reunite thought and feeling, is to reunite feeling and feeling, and to do this through a variety of exercises, one of which could be the use of this still banned, but possibly helpful substance known as MDMA, which can connect you more usefully to bits of your unconscious. It's an illegal substance, so it's hard to discuss on a stage. But I think it's shown very promising results, and I think it's definitely something to explore. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. Can I ask you about conflict resolution in relationships? Is it better to nip it in the bud with an early apology, or is it better to have it out and get to the root of the problems?
Well, I mean, there's a passive-aggressive apology. Oh, of course you're right. No, of course. Yeah. Well, let's, that's no good. Obviously, that's no good. Really dangerous. And this is why, the proverbial people pleaser in relationships is a really dangerous character. It's no fun. I mean, somebody who's grown, beware. Somebody tells you, I had a very volatile parents. Every time I had a problem, if I thought of bringing it to them, they would go crazy, or they'd get so depressed, they'd start weeping hysterically. Careful, listen to that, because what that person's really telling you is, every time I want to bring something serious to you, I won't. And so the first thing you'll hear about my problem is that I may be out, or not feeling that I want to have any sex. What's the desire not to have sex? Very often the desire to have sex is that you're furious with your partner. Well, why weren't you furious in the other way? Because you couldn't. Maybe because they weren't listening, or you weren't speaking. So there's a real onus on both sides to speak and to listen. Too often we put the spotlight on the non-listener. We go, oh, my partner never listens, they never listen, etc. Are you speaking? Are you speaking? I've got a client who is just, daughter of alcoholics. Children of alcoholics are not known for speaking a lot, because if your parent is out of control, you're not going to bring them any problems. So you're going to tend to be very shut down and very meek. And then what will happen in adult life is you've got a problem, and the first thing that your partner hears about it is, well, they don't. They never hear about it. And that's not great either. So conflict resolution, yes, to be able, but there's a real difference between how you say it. And this is where we can think about diplomacy. We know diplomacy at a governmental level. We know a person called a diplomat, who governments will say, traditionally, if you think of the origins of diplomacy, the king said, screw the bloody neighbour and his fat whatever, and then the diplomat would go, my liege, my master thinks that perhaps, etc., and softens the message. So the message is intact, but the method of delivery has changed, and that's what diplomacy is. And we need diplomats, of course, in the bedroom. We need someone to use perhaps and maybe and I wonder. I mean, one of the first things they teach you in therapy school is the use of the word I wonder. If you say I wonder whether, that's so much, people get very defensive. So if you go, why are you such an idiot? But if you go, I wonder why sometimes you miss things that would be so valuable to hear. It's great. I mean, children should be taught this, right? You should, starting statement, I hate you, diplomatic statement. I wonder if there might be something in the way of, what I mean. And we think it's terribly English, but it's wonderful. It's marvelous. Because it's aiming at the truth. This is not Englishness as such. It's actually aiming at the truth, but it's aware that the truth has to enter another person's mind wrapped in diplomatic language. Often.
Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I've got the mic here.
I don't know who it is, but go for it. Whoever it is, speak.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Many years ago, a kid in America divorced his parents.
Yeah.
Successfully, I believe. Is there ever a case for divorcing one's parents?
I mean, look, you can't divorce your parent. I mean, I don't know about this kid, how he did it, but how they did it. But you can't really divorce your parents. But I think your question is pointing to something very serious, which is what do you do with parents who are extremely difficult? And there's an impulse sometimes to, cut them off. The options are not that many. You either shut up and just go and see them and hope everything's okay, or you say, I can't bear it, I'm never seeing you again, or a version of something. And Christmas time coming up, generally we muddle through, in this horrific kind of compromise where we can't really get across what's important. So I think it matters less what you actually say to your parents than your own relationship to your parents in your mind. Generally, as a general rule, I think it's quite tricky. If somebody didn't get it over the first 25 years, they're unlikely to have a conversion, in the next 25 years. It does happen, but on the whole, the thing you are in touch with and are allowed is your internal relationship to your parents, and that you can work on, and that gives you a lot more freedom.
Hi.
Yes, yes, go for it.
I've often thought intuitively that it's more important to first like Not love them first, love and respect. Would you agree with that?
Well, look, no. Look, at least I'm being facetious, slightly facetious, but one of the tricky things about relationships is they are not friendships. They may involve a friendship component, but they are not merely friendship. They're this is why it's so difficult. They're this extremely complex mixture of a friendship and a physical attraction. And it's extremely perplexing, because what you've got to try and do is to find somebody who combines at least elements of those two very important factors. And so I think to merely say, I'm just going to pick somebody who's really sensible choice, and I'm just going to learn to desire them. I mean, it could be a long time. I mean, it might happen, but very often these things are slightly outside our remit. So we have to learn to realize that we are on the high seas, and rather like a good sailor, we have to adjust the sails to prevailing conditions that we are not fully in control of, and to acknowledge our lack of control is generous to ourselves in the complexity of what we're facing. One last question, if we can. Yeah.
So when it comes to confusing the familiar for love, are there any kind of core fundamental principles that one can apply when it comes to actually embracing and having the capacity for healthy love itself?
Yes, I mean, that's such a good question. I think if we find ourselves in a relationship where we know rationally that lots is really brilliant, we may even know that we desire them, etc., etc., and yet something is feeling rather eerie and strange. It's also sometimes been known as the ick, the proverbial ick. We may be able to think, part of the problem is that I'm finding the goodness that's on offer really troubling. And almost to be able to say to your partner, I mean, the more you're able to take your partner into the strangeness of being you, the more you'll find out whether your partner is actually for you. Because a partner that's for you basically should never stop being curious. The odder and odder you are. When two people meet on a first date, everyone tries to be very normal. You like golf? Oh, I like golf too. You like, so, you know, etc. Normal. If things have gone well, by the 100th date or even the 4th date, the person should be starting to make room for their eccentricities and strangeness. And the person that we belong to isn't the person who, you know, shares our every taste, but they're willing to go with us into the eccentricities of being human. On that basis, please come and see me in the bookshop afterwards, and such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.